Now, I think the first thing that we have to look at before we can try to answer this question that we are on, how Hellenized did the scattered Jews become, is what is Hellenism? And since our study last week was Hebraism versus Hellenism, what is Hebraism? Well, let me spend about 30 seconds on Hebraism, and then we'll spend the rest of the time on Hellenism. Hebraism, although it's kind of a funny-sounding name, is a word that you should be able to see Hebrew in, Hebraism, Hebraism. And so Hebraism is just the Old Testament, the Jewish way of life. Now that's kind of a simplification because we do know that in the period between the Testaments, the Jews have lost one form of sin, as we'll see later, idolatry, and picked up another form. Let's say that another way, that they've lost one form of sin, crass, literal idolatry, and they've picked up another form of sin, and that is rabbinical legalism, which is idolatry to a religious code, which is just as bad, if not worse, in another sense. And so the people have changed, but I think I took over my 30 seconds, so I better stop there. Hebraism is the Old Testament, so we don't have to define that. It's Hebraism versus Hellenism. We do want to know what actually is Hellenism before we can answer the question, were the Jews Hellenized? So let's start with some terms, and we'll get into some more terms next week or the next go around. And there are a lot of them in the New Testament, all different types of terms. They're all basically the same, but some that are nouns, adverbs, adjectives, some that are feminine, some that are masculine, and so forth, especially in the book of Acts that speak of the Greek people. And so Hellenes is basically the term that we need to be concerned about tonight, which would look like this, H-E-L-L-E long N-E-S, Hellenes. The term had been used, Hellenes, H-E-L-L-E long E-N-E-S, had been used, as early as 700 B.C. The Greeks are an old people, not as ancient as the Egyptians, but they do go back perhaps earlier than you would think if you just think of Alexander. But that's when they really become consolidated as a people. Before that, they're all broken up in splinter groups that we call city-states. But anyway, the term had been used as early as 700 B.C. to speak of the Greek people living in the country of Greece, bound by a common literature, mythology, language, culture. Now you can either take that last word as the fourth one in the grouping or kind of a summing up of the others. I'm really not trying to give a technical definition to culture or something, but the way they spoke, the way they lived, their metaphysical beliefs, their writings, which are always important for any literate society, pretty much made up what I'm thinking of as I describe them bound by one culture. Hellenes, used as early as 700 B.C. Now, as they came into contact, the Greek people, with other non-Greeks, or I should say with non-Greeks, especially in trading, merchant adventures, this self-awareness helped to develop the term more and helped to develop the antithetical term to that, which was barbaroi. B-A-R-B-A-R-O-I. Barbaroi. And so, of course, Hellenes, what we get from that is Greek or Greece. Let's call him a Greek. And, of course, what we get from this is a barbarian. So forth. The terms are antithetical to one another. And I think this is very similar to what we have in the Old Testament Jewish theology of the Hebrew people, and there would be one Hebrew term, and the Goyim, the nations, the Gentiles, foreigners, strangers, the other term, speaking of the other people, so that you've got your group and everyone else that's not a part of your group. That's the way the Greeks are thinking here. I'm saying that as they come into contact with non-Greeks, a self-awareness develops itself. And that helps to further the development of this term, Hellenes, as well as the introduction and the furthering of its antithesis or antithetical term, which is barbaroi. You were either a Greek or you were not. And that was determined by the things that I just listed here, your mythology, your language, the way you dressed, where you lived, the type of life that you lived, your literature, the arts, and so forth. And if you were not a Greek, then you were a barbarian. Now, the Jews had the same type of view, although I think it had a different basis, and it was a spiritual basis for the Jewish people. And that's a very important note of distinction there. For the Greeks, it was a cultural thing. For the Hebrews, it was a spiritual or religious distinction between Israel and the Goyim. So we would have the Greek and the barbarians. We would have the Hebrew. Hebrew is the most ethnic way of saying it instead of Israelite or Jew. Hebrew is certainly the most ethnic way. And we would have the Goyim. Very similar, in other words, to barbarians. Now, as I think I might have said before, it's rather obvious. It's kind of like lay knowledge in Greek studies, but then maybe you don't know it, so maybe I should say it. Barbarian, for a Greek, didn't mean what we mean by barbarian today, as some uncouth, uncivilized, backwards or something person. Because, listen, the Greeks came into contact with some very highly developed peoples and cultures and civilizations. So when we speak of barbarian, we mean, Conan, that type of barbarian. The savage, the Cro-Magnon man. That's not what is meant by this term. So don't be anachronistic here and read our thoughts and definition of barbaroi back into this. That's not what they meant. They simply meant someone who was not a Greek. And the Hebrews simply meant someone who was not a part of our religious group or religious faith by this term goyim. So let's keep that distinction in our mind, that for the Greeks, the difference between themselves and others is a difference of culture. And for the Hebrews, the difference between them and others is religious and spiritual in nature. So for the Greeks, it centers more on philosophy and theater and the arts, the gymnasium, their mythology, their language, their literature, in short, the way that they live. But in this early period of time, 700 BC, you really have no Hellenization really taking place, not Hellenization as such that we can speak of. So there's kind of an early look, an overview of some of the early history behind the basic term Hellenes, from which we get Hellenization and exactly what that means. The adoption of the Greek way of life by non-Greeks. Now let's come into some of the later history then. In other words, we'll be starting 4th century up until the time of the New Testament. Later history and development of this concept of Hellenization. And all of this got off the ground the mid-4th century BC with the consolidation of the Greek city-states under Philip the Fourth, king of Macedon, and more specifically his son Alexander. The consolidation of these Greek, which had been earlier warring city-states, through the establishment of a Macedonian empire, as we've looked at some time ago and in some detail in this class, under the likes of Philip, king of Macedon, and his son Alexander, who became known as the Great, did more to spread Greek civilization than anything else. Prior to that, the Greeks are too concerned about fighting themselves. As we've discussed before, and I don't want to go into that, and I'm not going to go into that again, but because of, simple things such as their language, they spoke different dialects right in the country of Greece, and maybe more specifically, just because of the topography and the terrain of the land. Greece is a very mountainous country, if you've ever studied about it or been there. Then the peoples were divided up with, the great city-states. You had people in Sparta, you had people in Athens, you had those in Corinth, you had those up in Thermopylae, you had those in Philippi and Thessalonica and so forth. And you're all divided up as a result of that, basically because of the topography, as well as the various dialects of Greek that were being spoken. So what happens 350 BC is Philip, the fourth king of Macedon, consolidates all of this, unifies all of this. Now the Greeks are no longer fighting themselves. In other words, they can turn their eyes outwardly instead of inwardly, as they have been for the last few hundred years. And this is particularly seen in the conquest of Alexander the Great. And I'm saying that this did more than anything else before it. This spread Greek civilization, which is what Hellenization is all about, the adoption of the Greek way of life by non-Greeks. And so we know about Alexander the Great's great success in his military adventures. And he had to come up, because of his great success in conquering one nation after another, and of course the great power that he was up against was Persia, and we've seen before some of the great battles that were fought. Some of the ones fought and lost by the Greeks, but most of them were fought and won by the Greeks, and the Persians finally, Xerxes had his whole navy sunk, and so that was kind of the end of the Persian rule, and the Greeks went eastward as a result of that. But because he conquered so much, Alexander has to come up with some plan of unification, or some plan of coherence to gather together all of these now defeated peoples. The nationalism of the people had been conquered. The people don't even see themselves as a people anymore. And that's because each of them, each of the countries and the cultures had their own local as well as national deities. And of course, they were smart to realize this, that deities who don't help you in war don't deserve the rank of God. And the Greeks had come in and defeated them, and they, in other words, they saw an immediate connection with their rise or fall in their pantheon. And the gods who don't help don't deserve to be worshipped as gods, and so they surrendered their gods. And so nationalism has gone, but they're still an independent people because of all the other things they have, like their culture, like their language, like the way they dress. And so Alexander has to come up with a plan of coherence that involves replacing a conquered nationalism with his own Greek culture to produce an international state in which all would be at home. And this is exactly what he does, and that's what the whole process and term Hellenization is about and means. Now, I don't intend to imply here that we would now have, a wholesale Greek way of life everywhere in the empire, because there are going to be the remains of the Oriental lands and cultures there. So rather than seeing a pure Greco culture arise, I think what we have to see, rather obviously, is a combination of Greek and non-Greek ideas. So we could call it a Greco-Oriental culture that arises upon the ruins of the conquered nationalism of these peoples in the past. But I still think that Hellenization is a good term, and it's the term that historically has been used for this. Alexander the Great comes into these areas. He conquers the people. That pretty much does away with their gods and their spirit of nationalism. He's got to incorporate his way of life, which, of course, for Alexander, raised on the classics, he thought was the best. And yet you can't do it wholesale, because they're going to be vestigial remains of these people in their earlier life. So I think it's Greco-Oriental culture that we see, and we're going to still refer to that as Hellenization. Now, just a word or two on this term Hellenism as it's being used right now and as it's been used for some time technically, that is the adoption of the Greek way of life by non-Greeks. The term was coined by J.G. Droysen, D-R-O-Y-S-E-N, by J.G. Droysen in his doctoral dissertation written in 1831. He was the first to use Hellenism as we do now. That is the Greek expansion of culture in the Orient under Alexander the Great. We've touched on this some before in our look at the political backgrounds to the period between the Testaments. So make sure that you're with us up to date on exactly what we mean now by Hellenism and Hellenization. It doesn't say anything of the Greeks. The Greek is already a Greek. It's the adoption of the Greek way of life by non-Greeks. That's what Hellenization or Hellenism is all about. The adoption of the Greek way of life. Now that's the rather broad phrase there, the Greek way of life. How you live, where you live, what you do, what you think, your beliefs, your language, your literature, the way you dress. All these things would be included. The adoption of the Greek way of life by non-Greeks. So the Greek term goes back, of course, as we've seen, almost 3,000 years, but it's been used in the last couple of hundred years in a very technical sense. It has to do with the spread of Greek culture under that great Greek leader, Alexander the Great. Now, the majority vote of the conquered East and the peoples there, I think, was certainly in favor of accepting the process of Hellenization. As I've already said, they don't have a lot to lose by that. They've already been defeated by the Greeks. Their gods have already been proven to be impotent, and so it only stands to reason that they're going to be willing to accept the Greek way of life. And for the most part, that's true. To an extremely large degree, that's true. Or we wouldn't have what we know to be true, the spread of the Greek language, which is just a sign of the spread of Greek culture all over the Oriental world. Remember in our earlier studies, Alexander goes from Greece all the way to the Indus River in India, spreading his culture. He conquers, through conquering Persia, he's conquered Media, because those two had conquered Babylon, and Babylon had conquered Assyria. He's mastered all of those cultures and civilizations now. And that's why he has the name Alexander the Great. Now, from a Christian perspective, that's not great, but I guess on a worldly scale, a whole lot of people who have the name something, something great don't deserve the name. They're not as deserving of it as someone like Alexander was. He had such a profound impact on people for so many years after his time. I think the people of the conquered lands would also be in favor of the Greeks because, after all, it was from Greece we have our famous writers and philosophers and artists and so forth. And the Oriental people knew of this. Now, let's talk a moment or two before we get into some other things about Hellenization. Let's talk a moment or two about where we see any beginnings of Hellenization in the Old Testament. Of course, we're talking about the period between the Testaments, but Greek influence came at a very, very early time. For instance, in the book of Joel, now it all depends on when you date Joel, but if you date it back at the end of the 9th century BC, which is what we've done before, around 835 BC. Some people want to date it, much later than that, but it's very early. It's a very early Old Testament minor prophet. Then we see very early Greek influence. For instance, in Joel 3 and verse 6, the Grecians are mentioned as travelers, as merchantmen, as a matter of fact, as slave dealers. That's in Joel 3 and verse 6. That's at a very, very early time. We've talked about Hellenes, the term, going back to 700 BC. Well, we're 135 years earlier than that, if we date Joel 3 at the end of the 9th century BC. Furthermore, we see Greek influence mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 27, verses 13 and 19, where you've got the old Hebrew term that's simply transliterated Javan. You find that term even earlier, back in the book of Genesis, but we don't see any influence there. Just the name is mentioned as origin of a people. But in Ezekiel 27, which is kind of like a lament on the downfall of Tyre, this great Phoenician seaport and maritime power, the Greeks are mentioned among many other nations. That's why Ezekiel 27 is rather famous. Mentioned among many other nations as a seagoing people and as a group of traders. But that's really not what we would call Greek influence with the Jewish people. I mean, it just pops up on a couple of occasions, and you read the passages carefully, and you don't have Hellenization. Officially, Hellenization begins in Israel with the conquest of Alexander the Great. Remember that the control by the Ptolemies and the Seleucids caused great problems for the nation of Israel. controlled by the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the period between the Testaments, caused the greatest influence of the Greek way of life in Palestine. Now, the penetration of the Greek language was the first conquest of Hellenism, and I think the longest lasting as well. But as we say, we see it here and there spread out in the Old Testament. Another passage comes to mind where you see Greek influence, and that's in the book of Daniel, the 3rd chapter. I'll have to look the verses up. But there are these well-known musical instruments here. Like in verse 5. You have them listed on several occasions in this chapter. Verse 5, verse 10, verse 15. All three of those verses are almost identical if you read them. Daniel 3, 5, 7, 10, and 15. You got it at least 4 times. Now here's what the King James has. I'll read verse 5. And it's very difficult to know what instruments are being spoken of here. But I have most of the words marked out in mine and something better written in, because the King James was giving us, Elizabethan musical instruments, and they didn't have that back in Daniel's days. And what Daniel is giving us is what we call Greek loan words. Now, there are Persian loan words in books like Ezra and Nehemiah and Zechariah and Daniel. But we have Greek loan words here. By the way, that's one of the arguments, maybe we have this on an earlier tape in OT Intro, that's one of the arguments the critical scholars bring up to prove that Daniel should be dated the 2nd century B.C. instead of the 5th or 6th century B.C. But we don't really have a problem here, because as we've already seen, everyone will admit that Ezekiel goes back to this time, and he's saying that the Greeks are traveling. So if the Greeks are traveling, then the Hebrews and the 590s, 580s B.C. could have some knowledge of Greek words and of Greek instruments in. Well, anyway, to get back to reading it, verse 5, that at that time, or what time, you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music. And notice that KJV spelling of music, as we pointed out. You fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And so you'll go through it again in verse 7. The sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music. In verse 10. See, I kind of got this memorized because I noticed this a long time ago. Hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer. You could almost get a square dancing jig out of that, I think. Or something. I know you could play some game with that. And then verse 15. See, it's just repeated again and again. You've got, at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music. Just go over and over and over. And so I have things like triangle, harp, and some other things written in here, horns and so forth. I don't know about that cornet and sackbut. What do you think a sackbut is? Well, that's a good old King James term for musical instruments, but I doubt the Greeks had sackbuts, neither the instrument nor the term. So there's another place I'm thinking of. There are some other places. Those are some of the chief places, the ones that come to my mind right now, where you see Greek influence by words or by their travel or something in the Old Testament. But it's not until the time of Alexander, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Maccabees, and so forth, where you really see dangerous inroads being made into Palestine, into the Jewish faith and worship by the Greek people. Now, I have brought along a book here because it's kind of like the classic on the subject, Martin Hengel's Judaism and Hellenism, 2 volumes published in one. Now, your favorite book supplier, Christian Book Distributors, happens to be trying to get rid of these, I noticed. They have it on sale from $22 marked down to $7.50, which is quite a saving. But I wouldn't recommend you go out and buy it. It is Hengel's doctoral dissertation, and that's exactly what it reads like, too. His doctoral dissertation presented back in the 1960s, I believe, to the University of Tübingen in Germany, which is a hyper-literal school. But it's kind of like the classic on the subject, so if you know anything about it, or if you pretend like you know anything about it, you're supposed to at least have this sitting on your shelf. So it sits on my shelf. I have read it. I should say that, but you would have probably guessed that anyway. And I'll just make a couple of references that won't be to you. I guess they'll just be to the tape or to the air, in case somebody hears this and, well, he didn't really read Hengel's book here. On pages 65 and 66, page 70, and pages 77 through 74, Hegel has a good discussion of, I think, what potentially was the most damaging early influence of Hellenism on the Jewish people in Palestine, and that was in the area of education, and that was through the so-called gymnasium. The gymnasium for the Greeks was not so much a place of athletic games and contests, but it had an educational purpose behind it, although athletics were involved in that. So I'll just mention that. Pages 65 through 75, we could say, there are some good references. Maybe I'll even read one little statement here. On page 75, the top of page 75, in a section entitled Greek Education and Culture and Palestinian Judaism, and subtitled Hellenism as a Force in Education. Hegel writes, according to 2 Maccabees 4:13, these events, and he's been talking about a lot of technical matters here, these events marked, quote, an extreme, he's quoting from Maccabees, an extreme of Hellenization. And then he gives the Greek akme tis Hellenismou in Jerusalem. They were only conceivable on the basis of a lengthy period of preparation in which Hellenistic influences in Jerusalem had long been at work, though we do not know much about them. That's a very interesting point. We do not know very much about them, but he's still got about 500 pages on the subject, though. And you see the second half is nothing but notes. The book is only 300 pages, and the notes take up, about 350 pages. So I wouldn't recommend you go out and buy the book, even though you can get it marked down from $22 to $7.50. There's sometimes, some people just buy things because they're on sale. I mean, it's a bargain. Let's just get it while it's on sale. You could better spend $7.50 in buying Hegel's book. But there it is, the classic book, Martin Hegel, Judaism and Hellenism. But I didn't get much of my material out of there at all because he doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, this whole process reached a climax with Antiochus IV Epiphanes and Jason the high priest, which we also have on some tapes extensively, in 175 BC. The abomination of desolations, and the Maccabees come, and Judas Maccabeus and his father Mattathias, the priest of Modin, and all of this, and the Feast of Rededication. We've already gone through all of that before. So just see earlier tapes, you can say in your notes. But it reaches a climax in Israel, in Palestine, 175 BC, with the new northern king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and the renegade Jewish high priest at this time, whose name was Jason. Now, do I have your attention and your understanding up to date here? Well, let me break it down a little more, still asking this question, what is Hellenism? Although I think we pretty much know what it is. Or asking it this way, what did Hellenization consist of? And I want to list about 6 things here, which would really be then an explanation of what I mean by the, quote, Greek way of life. Hellenization or Hellenism is the adoption of the Greek way of life by non-Greeks. So what does the Greek way of life consist of, point by point by point? All right, here we go then. What did Hellenization consist of? Remember what the background all of this is. We're asking ourselves, did those Jews who were, let's say, 25 AD, the year AD 25, those Jews who are scattered all out into the empire, are they living the type of life that we're going to be discussing here? Did they pick all of this up from the Greeks, and is this the way that they're living? So that we have a certain type of Greek or a certain type of Jewish theology out in the diaspora, a very unorthodox form, and another form of Jewish theology back in Palestine. That's the backdrop to why we're discussing this. All right, number 1 would be dress. I think that's certainly one of the more superficial factors. But all peoples and cultures have a certain way to dress. Now, I could digress on a lot of these. I think a lot of thoughts come to my mind here. You have the old sanctified worldlings today who try to use this as, a cultural argument. Well, every group has their own way to dress, and so when you start ruling out, certain specific items and forms of dress right here in the United States, well, that won't carry over cross-culturally. Well, of course it won't. No fool would say that, because if they don't wear shoes over in some other place, we couldn't rule them out for them. But principles are involved in every culture. A person can't argue, well, now, just because National Geographic has popularized the breast of African women, that makes it okay for them to be bare-breasted overseas. No, immodesty is immodesty. If you have dropped so far in your understanding of truth or light in some foreign pagan culture that it's just no taboo at all to go around with no clothes on, that doesn't make it right. As a matter of fact, we've just described or explained why you're doing that. You have degenerated so much and devolved so much. So, I could digress. I hope you see what I'm talking about there. Secondly, on Hellenization, another thing that it consisted of was recreation. The Greeks are known for their games. I'm sure you won't even have to read a technical book on this. You've heard of the Olympics, have you not? They're coming up next year. Well, that goes back to ancient Greece, doesn't it?
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape over.
They're coming up next year. Well, that goes back to ancient Greece, doesn't it? The Greeks are world famous for their games, their athletic contests. Paul has a reference to them. I could digress on this little note, 1 Corinthians 9. The reason I say I could digress and then go ahead and do, or at least give you a sentence or two, is just to continue to combat this worldly spirit that's in the church today and the false methods of interpretation that all these scholars are trying to bring to us. They tell us that because Paul makes a reference to athletic games here in 1 Corinthians 9, then Paul loved to visit professional wrestling matches. That came up in an article I read to you a few weeks or months ago. This is 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27. Paul makes reference to it. Paul uses this metaphor of running to win a prize or fighting to win a prize over and over again. That doesn't mean that Paul is out there doing all of that, like stripping off his apostolic garb and joining into the Olympics if he can win a couple of medals and say, well, I want to praise God that I won the Olympic medal here. Now, Paul uses that for Christian advantages, not by participating, but by using it as a metaphor when he writes about it. I find that interesting. I mean, Paul, he was traveling around the Olympic Games all the time, and as I'm always criticizing, and you hear me say, and you'll hear it, you watch the next Olympics, somebody will win something, a black boxer, and he'll say, I want to thank my mother and God that I beat that fella to a bloody pulp over there. And he may be a white fella, and he won't be able to talk any better than that. The only thing they've learned in school is how to sign their name so they can autograph, boxing gloves and footballs and baseballs and basketballs and all of that nonsense. That ought to be outlawed, sending guys through school. And I know about that because a fellow who turned professional in football, he was a punter, a barefoot punter for the San Francisco 49ers, sat behind me in English class and never did a thing. I mean, I don't even think he could have fought his way out of a wet paper bag when it came to spelling. He could probably write his name, and that was about all. He sat behind me in sophomore literature class. And the teacher knows that he's a star athlete on the team. This is sophomore literature, and he goes on to the 49ers as a pro, a barefoot punter, and you see him on television all the time. Sat behind me in class, never did a thing, and the teacher let him off. You have to do that. You got to pamper the star athletes there. That's just a well-known syndrome in colleges and universities now. So we could bring up all types of arguments why that ought to be outlawed. Let people just play it on the side. But when you get into all the fancy stuff of college and universities and then it becomes a profession, I don't think God ever intended a man as his working profession to run around with a pigskin in his hand. That's to do out in the backyard. You're not supposed to do that to make a living. Something's immoral about that. or to stand there with a stick and slug balls to make a living. I mean, you do that to have fun. That's a relaxation thing for you. Or the worst one of all, hitting little balls and then chasing them for so long. If you want the ball, don't hit it. Why hit it and then run after it? But I know there's supposed to be some purpose to that game. I used to play it. My father was good. He's got trophies stacked everywhere. My mother was a golfer, and I golfed for a while until I just came to my senses. And I mean, when you hit a baseball, you want it to go and just go, stay gone. You hope nobody can find it because that means a home run. But then you knock your golf ball into the weeds somewhere, and you're the fool who has to go find the thing then. It's kind of counterproductive, I always thought. Well, so much for some of you that play golf in here. You'll have to work that out on your own. Ask your wife for advice. 2 Timothy 4, verse 7, another reference over here. I have fought a good fight. And I've actually got books on my shelves where some lunatic of a theologian translates that verse into Paul involved in some boxing match somewhere. That is a biblical proof text that professional boxing is okay because Paul said, I fought a good fight. Well, as I often say, people with that level of intelligence don't deserve an audience, except other kindergarten children that would fit in with that type of thinking. So here's one thing of Hellenization. The second thing we're on, recreation, games, and the athletic contest. And you could throw gymnasium in because games are involved there, although you could also fit that under education. Thirdly, another thing that we describe Hellenization by was science. Science, advancement, discoveries, and so forth. Here you have the great work done by men such as Euclid, the mathematician, Archimedes, who made discoveries in the physical sciences like gravity and the water screw and the lever and the principle of buoyancy, and Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference at about 25,000 miles at the equator. And he happened to be right. That was thousands of years ago. And you can put in your notes, see ITP tape number 20, where I give you the history of those three examples right there, from Euclid to Eratosthenes. I explain how Eratosthenes discovered this. He was at one place in Egypt, I think this took place down in Egypt, on a certain day, and he goes to another place and he measures the shadow of the sun. And brilliantly, he calculates the distance, the circumference of the Earth, the distance around the Earth at the equator, at about 25,000 miles. And that's about what it is. Hasn't changed. So, you see, the Greeks had a lot to offer. I mean, as far as scientific advancement is concerned, they had a whole lot to offer. And these are just three men as examples that I discussed on ITP tape 20. Fourthly, literature. Everyone's heard of the Greek classics, have we not? Literature, the epics, the histories, the comedies, the world-famous Greek tragedies. We've discussed a lot of that on earlier tapes as well. Fifthly, and this was the most widespread avenue of Hellenization, and that is language. We know how important this was. I mean, the Christians even came along and used it both to their own and through that to the world's great advantage in evangelism. How could you go out preaching to those people if you couldn't speak their language? So God, we have looked at this earlier, providentially paved the way for the spread of early Christianity with the introduction of Greek as the common language of the common man all over the empire. From India through Persia to Egypt to Palestine to North Africa to Rome to Greece, people spoke Greek. So it was a great benefit for the early Christian apostles and disciples to have this at their disposal. In other words, they didn't have to go to a school like Wycliffe Institute, or Wycliffe Institute, and learn a new language in order to witness. They already had the language that the other people had. And then finally, and if you wonder where education is, I kind of sum that up under literature there. Sixthly, we have the mythology, the theology, and the philosophy of the Greek people. Now here is where we arrive at some of the deeper, more important aspects of Hellenism. I mean, are we really going to consider someone Hellenized if they keep everything about their old former way of life except they change their garments and they adopt Greek dress? Well, I don't think you could call them Hellenized. We're going to have a combination of some of these factors that you have listed before you now, and specifically when you get for the Jews we're talking about, whenever you get down into this last area, mythology, theology, and philosophy. I mean, we know that the Jews did take over the Greek language and they spoke Greek. Well, that's not Hellenization in itself. Hellenization is the adoption of the Greek way of life by non-Greeks. Just taking their language, that's part of it, but that's not all of it. There are lesser and greater degrees, you see, of adopting the Greek way of life. And so this would be the most important area. If the Jews, for instance, of the diaspora, and if this can be proven, were to, with open arms, embrace the mythology, theology, philosophy, the metaphysical beliefs of the Greek people, then there's no question about the matter but that we have the process of Hellenization. And there's no question about the matter but that the Jews of the diaspora are anything but Orthodox. If they do this, assuming that they do this. That's a big if, though. And that's what we're after, to see whether or not they did do that. If you adopt other people's metaphysical beliefs, then it's going to very much change and influence your life. And so in one sense, all of this added up, from dress through recreation, science, literature, education, language, and mythology, all of this added up equals culture, the Greek way of life. Not just one thing. Some are more important than others. The language is more widespread than the others. Some are more important, such as number 6, metaphysical beliefs. But all of this, in one sense, when you add it up, equals culture, equals the Greek way of life. And so the question is, did any of this touch the Jews? What we have here is a question of influence in the world that's very much similar to what we're studying in Christian ethics with regard to the church and worldliness. Because the church doesn't live in a special place. The church lives in the world. The church is truly a diaspora people. They don't live in heaven. Their final citizenship is there, but where do they live right now? In the body. They live in the world. So it's a very similar question here, a question of influence. Were the Jews influenced? As we know, the church is certainly being influenced by her life in the world today. Well, we know that if we turn to the pages of the Old Testament, Israel had unsuccessfully wrestled with this matter since her inception as a nation. And she had wrestled with it the whole time that she had lived, not out in the world, but in Palestine. If you can't make it at home, it stands to reason you can't make it away from home either. She doesn't do very well at home. I mean, she's not spread out into the world. She invites the world into her borders. And her failure to ward worldliness off finally led to her fall. That's the whole theme of the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 28 and verse 36. Blessing, obedience will bring blessing, and disobedience will bring discipline. And her failure to ward off this pagan influence around her, which wasn't in Palestine except by her admitting it in, finally led to Israel's fall. Then she ends up actually captive in Babylon. Now that's captive in Babylon. She's not in Palestine. She's away from home. So we would expect an inescapable influence here. Was she influenced in Babylon? Yes. What happened whenever the great cry of the post-exilic leaders went up, it's time to return. God has touched the heart of Cyrus, and he's passed a decree for us to return. Well, what was the response of most of the people? They chose to stay in Babylon. Now that shows a tremendous, profound influence which is resting upon Israel now, upon her subconsciousness and upon her existence as a people. Most chose to remain there rather than face an uncertain future in an uninhabited, unbuilt land. I mean, it was one thing back in the earlier days, you always had the temple you could run to, and you had all of the things that Israel had accomplished over a period of about, well, a little over a half of a millennium, from the time, the great times of David and Solomon, great as far as materialism, I guess, is concerned. From that time all the way down to the time of the prophet Jeremiah. This is the last of those great prophets crying against Israel, repent or God will send you into Babylon. And now they have to go back into a land that has no temple, that was razed to the ground and burnt with fire. Goodly houses and the palaces and so forth were destroyed. The children of Abraham had been uprooted and taken out of the land, and pagans had been brought into the land. The Samaritans had come down from the north, or really central Israel, and kind of were overrunning Judea. That's a rather bleak future ahead of you. That's a rather daunting prospect to have to leave Babylon, where after all, remember, they were in ease and comfort there, and God had told them they would be. If you'll settle down there for the period of 7 years, you won't be able to do anything about it for at least 70 years. Settle down, build homes, marry, give in marriage, plant your vineyards, and stay. But he didn't mean do that forever and ever. He meant stay until chastisement is over, and then you'll have to go back home. Well, they had already built everything. They didn't want to surrender that then. 70 years later, the man Daniel, who is an old prophet by this time, he doesn't get to go back to Palestine, but he's the one doing all the praying in Daniel 9. Because there we're told that when he understood by the books, according to the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, that they would be there 70 years, and the 70 years were just about up, then he set his face toward God in the place in Jerusalem to begin praying about the whole matter. And then as a result, we see that Cyrus passes a decree so that they're allowed to go back. Daniel doesn't get to participate in that, but that's because he's an old man at the time. But there are many people who were born in Babylon. You'd have grandchildren already now born in Babylon. They'd be young people, prime prospects to return. But it was a daunting task to have to go back to an uncertain future in an unbuilt land. Very comfortable just to remain and to stay in Babylon. So what I'm saying, what we see here is the influence that the Babylonian captivity had on most of the people. The largest group that went back, and that was the first one, and that was under Zerubbabel, was only 50,000 people. After that, by the time you get down to the people that go back with Ezra and Nehemiah, you're down to just a few thousand. And that's counting the slaves, and, well, Ezra has to go back and talk some of the Levites into coming. None of them come. Whenever he counts the groups and according to genealogy and finds who's there, not a single minister of the Lord there. Not a single minister. According to the book of Ezra, they had all stayed behind. So he has to go back and talk a few of the Levites into coming. You got to have the priesthood there. You've got to have ministry back there. You can't start up the temple or sacrifice or liturgy or anything. So it's quite a serious situation that we have. Now, as I said earlier, when I started the message, those who did return, this is something that the New Testament makes very manifest, were permanently cured of their number one Old Testament sin. And that was crass, literal idolatry. You never find a reference again to Israel ever bowing down to a stone statue or to the poles of Asherah. Never again. They had learned one thing through Babylonian exile and the horrors of the siege and torture and the 70-year period there. You find over and over again in the Old Testament prior to that Israel worshiping stone or wooden statues. As a matter of fact, you have one of the Ten Commandments. We can jump over there, the second of the Ten Commandments, which specifically addresses itself to this matter, which meant that Israel needed to hear this. And they didn't hear it. I mean, this is back in the law, Exodus chapter 20. Second commandment, which takes up verses 4 through 6. First commandment's a different commandment. The Catholics like to rearrange the way you count these, but in order to get 10 the scriptural way, if you take Deuteronomy 5 along with this, and verse 3 has to be separated from those next verses. It sounds like we're talking about the same commandment. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or the likeness of anything, but they're not. We could show that some other time, and maybe we have already in the past, I don't remember. But verses 4 through 5, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, earth beneath, water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. And I think about to the 1,000th generation as well, because they've been doing this over and over and over again, and finally the great, 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 great descendants of those people are the people who end up over in Babylon, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandment. There's a similar reading over in, Deuteronomy chapter 7, famous passage on God's election, where he said, I didn't choose you because you were great in number or mighty in strength, but just the opposite, because you weren't anything. And because I had given a promise to your forefathers. In essence, verse 8a, because the Lord loved you. And so we're told in verse 9 that he will keep covenant and mercy with them that love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. To 1,000 generations. And if you don't keep them, and then that rubs off on children who don't keep them, which rubs off on children who don't keep them, then it may be 1,000th generation that's sent into captivity for an entire accumulation of sins which have come in the past. So what we're saying is that they were permanently cured of their number one Old Testament sin, crass literal idolatry. I could just call it idolatry in the sense of those verses in Deuteronomy chapter 20, and that is making a graven image. However, the problem, as we'll see working our way through this class as we round it out in the next few months, and it doesn't touch what we're studying right now, but as we'll see later, substituted in the place of crass literal idolatry was the worship of religious codes and creeds, which God hated just as much. I mean, is it any worse to bow down before a statue carved with your own hands than to bow down before a creed written with your own hand? That's no worse in the eyes of God. I don't know why is it today the evangelicals think that they're better off than the Roman Catholics of the Middle Ages with their relics and parts of the cross and all of this, bowing down and worshiping and praying to the saints and all of this business, when they do the same thing to dead denominational creeds that don't have any support in the Word of God. If it doesn't have support in the Word of God, it's no better of a practice than crass literal idolatry. You're bowing down. In one sense, it could be said to be worse, because it ought to be rather easy to get your eyes open to the fact that if you are the one who carved the statue before you, it owes its life to you, not you to it. It couldn't be God. You'd have to be demon-possessed to think otherwise. I mean, that'd be an easy thing to get your eyes open to and to see, but when it's a religious creed, though, that after the creed is stated, then you've got a parenthesis and X number of Bible verses are put out beside that, a wrong interpretation of them, falsely supporting that, well, then you'll never see the light, because you're always assuming God's Word is behind this. And so this is exactly what Jesus came to deal with the religious leaders in the Gospels. And I know we've got a couple of earlier tapes on the whole matter. That was the one thing Jesus came to defeat, was false religious teaching. And when you've got later references, which are quotations of Psalm 110 in the New Testament, of the fact that Jesus will not come back until his enemy are under his feet, or his enemies are under his feet, then how are we going to interpret that? Who are his? His enemies aren't the communists or people in China or Castro. His enemies are those who pervert his teaching, who pervert the doctrine of Christ and the Word of God. And so they substitute one form of idolatry for another form of idolatry. Kind of the Old Testament theme is something like this, as I've given it to you before: out of Egypt into Babylon. Deliverance from evil into evil. And then if you want to kind of put from the end of the Old Testament right up into the New Testament, you'd have to be out of Babylon into false religion. I mean, it sounds like out of something into the same thing all over again, and that's exactly what it is. Out of Egypt into Babylon, out of Babylon into false man-made religion. You see, the Jews aren't telling us in the Gospels, they're not quoting from the pagan authors or something and saying, no, we've got, good Greek support for this, or Babylonian mystery religion support for this. No, they're saying, thus saith Moses and the prophets. They're quoting Moses and the prophets, but they're misinterpreting Moses and the prophets. So the rabbis have come with this false method of interpretation, and they have bound the people with burdens grievous to be borne, the doctrines and commandments of men that Jesus said are an abomination to God in Matthew 15. You have substituted the worship of God, the doctrines and commandments of men. So that's where, of course, we're headed in the study of Judaism whenever we get into future, later aspects of the religious backgrounds of the period between the Testaments. So I'm just giving you kind of in capsule form what it's all about. That they were cured of idolatry. Only one form of it, though. Nowhere in the Gospels you don't find Jesus ever having to come and correct someone because they're bowing down before an idol. You don't find him walking and all of a sudden he goes past the pool of Siloam and there are a couple of women over there and a man in their midst bowing down before the god of Tammuz or something. No, that's never done. No more. Permanently cured by Babylonian captivity. But in its place, it's a worse form because it's more subtle. And that's following the creeds of man under the guise of them being the creeds of God. So let's get back to the subject of Babylon. I just have a couple of more moments here and we'll be through then. Those who do return are permanently cured of their number one Old Testament sin, idolatry. Those who do not return, those who stayed in Babylon, or in other words, the great majority, for them, their stay in Babylon had a very debilitating effect. Deuteronomy 28:36, Deuteronomy 4:27-28, and Jeremiah 16 and verse 13. Jeremiah 16 and verse 13. Now, one last sentence or two and we'll be through tonight. Here's what I want to say about rounding out here with their experiences in Babylon. Gentile captivity had showed Israel firsthand what another people's culture was really like. For the first time, they had firsthand knowledge of what another people's culture was really like. And we find, as we notice in the post-exilic writings, because of the fact that most of them did remain in Babylon, that the Jews who stayed in Babylon were quite captivated and enamored by this. We have never studied geography and archaeology here, but Babylon, at least you're familiar with this, the so-called Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Babylon was a fantastic place. The Jews would have had to pass through what was called the Great Ishtar Gates, these huge, magnificent gates with lions, carved in stone statues sitting on both sides. It was a fabulous city. And the Jews go and look at all that and say, wow, look what these people's culture has done for them. Look at how prosperous and well off they are. Of course, those Jews who stayed there sank like a lead rock or stone along with the Babylonians whenever the Medes and Persians came in and subdued the people there. I mean, a lot of those that stay behind there that don't go whenever the Babylonians are conquered by the Medes and the Persians sink with the Babylonians, because the Medes and the Persians take it over and wipe out Babylonian culture and civilization to some degree anyway. So now they know what another people's culture is like firsthand. They're enamored by it. So then, by projection, by several hundred years, were then the Jews able to reject the process of Hellenization going on all around her in the diaspora Greek world?